So let me start with the usual disclaimer that I'm speaking today with my own personal views, not necessarily the views of the U.S. government. I say that because it accomplishes two things. One, it'll keep the government lawyers happy, and it will allow me to be more informative. So I'm the kind of person who is always up for a challenge. And I have two challenges today. One challenge is that I am the last thing between you and cocktails. The other challenge that I have, and Mark tipped me off about this, is that a few of you may be thinking, when you think about opportunities in clean tech and smart grid, a few of you may be thinking, oh my gosh, this is an area that is littered with the dead bodies of failed startups. How many of you have had that thought flash through your minds? Whoa. Okay, so I have a real challenge here because what I want to do is to explain to you that over the next 20 years, and all of these numbers will be approximate, there's about and just in the US alone, there's about $2 trillion of value that is up for grabs associated with the modernization of the electricity infrastructure. You add on top of that other infrastructures like natural gas, water systems, and so forth. This is just a huge opportunity that's up for grabs. And my challenge is to convince you that you shouldn't be thinking about dead bodies. You should be thinking about the grim fairy tale, the Frog Prince, okay? And you have no idea what I'm talking about. That's part of my ruse to get you to pay attention until cocktails. So I will come back to that. Hold that thought. I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so in terms of failed startups, there are a lot of failed startups in the clean tech arena, a lot of failed startups in the smart grid arena. But what's new? Okay, the innovation in any sort of major disruption that has created change and value is just littered with failed startups. But we also have, and I'm going to maybe start here by doing a little history lesson in the telecom sector. If you think about the transformation in the telecom sector over the last 30 years or so, there have been many failed startups, but we've also had legendary successes like Bob Metcalfe, who invented the Ethernet, like Irwin Jacobs, whose technology is embedded in just about every wireless phone, and Jeff Pulver, who was one of the founders of Vonage, which commercialized voice over IP. So which of you is going to be the Bob Metcalfe or the Irwin Jacobs or the Jeff Pulver of the electric grid? You may be here in this room. Well, in those days, we just thought of it as just plain old telephone service. 1984, the whole industry was very heavily regulated. As I mentioned before, we had a technology where you had it worked well, but it was inefficient for the traffic it was carrying, a good opportunity for new technologies. The structure of the market was very difficult if you were an entrepreneur. This was an entrenched monopoly, AT&T, very high barrier to entry. If you wanted to sell something to AT&T or Western Electric, very slow moving. You couldn't really connect to it if you had something you wanted to put on the edge. It was a closed system, very resistant to change. And yet, we did have some new competitors that were coming in. Remember MCI? What was MCI's value proposition? It was saving on your long distance bill, right? 2%? And yet MCI, grew into a very powerful force. People were interested in saving money on that 2% of their bill. Well, fast forward, and you know what's happened. So the brick phones that we had in 1984, or iPhones, the bays and bays of digital switching equipment are now the size of boxes, they're routers, and we think of voice as just another digital application along with many others. So how did this transformation happen? Well, I assert that the number one thing was determined entrepreneurs with a big vision. William McGowan, founder of MCI, he had a big vision. There was also disruptive technology. We had shifts in government and regulation, government policy and regulation that enabled competition. We had digital convergence, which enabled this new technology to be applied and develop many new services. Very important, and Mark mentioned this, was the shift to open standards, which really lowered the barriers to entry and facilitated innovation throughout the system. And of course, we had many new billionaires and many, many more failed startups. So what I assert is that in our infrastructures like the electric grid, we are just at the very early stages of a similar revolution that is going to play out over the coming decades in both our energy and transportation infrastructure. The system that has grown up in the U.S. over the last 100 years is a very large, fragmented, and complex system. Very large indeed. It's the largest in the world. We account, even though we only have about 5% of the world's population, we consume about 22% of the world's electricity. It's operated by 3,200 electric utility companies, and they're not monolithic. There are many different types. I'll talk about that later. And the system as a whole represents about $1 trillion in invested assets. The architecture of the system today operates in much the same fashion as it did 100 years ago. It's optimized to move power that is generated in large central bulk stations, mainly by burning fossil fuels, which contribute about 40% of human-caused CO2 production, and moving that power in a one-way flow from point of generation to point of consumption. The control of the system was predicated on the fact that you couldn't control the load on the system. It was what it was. You could predict it. There are very good forecasting models that will predict the load. What you could control is the generation, and so the trick is to balance, since you can't cost-effectively store electricity today. The trick is to balance in real time the generation with whatever the load happens to be. And the capacity of the system has to be sized, much as the telephone system was 30 years ago, for this infrequent peak demand, which means that on average, looking over the course of an entire year, the system operates at about 50% of capacity. 50% of capacity, okay. What capacity do airlines run on? How long would you be in business if you were in an airline flying with half your seats empty, right? Several years ago, Congress decided that revitalizing, renewing this critical infrastructure in the United States was a key national priority. It passed the Energy Independence and Security Act in 2007 that established this policy to support the modernization of the nation's electricity system. And so let me talk now about what are the drivers that are creating this policy to modernize the electric grid in the United States. And there are basically three. The first is this need for greater efficiency. What's driving this? Well, about 45% of our electricity is generated from coal, and half of the coal plants in the U.S. are more than 40 years old. And the EPA is in the process of introducing regulations that will make it uneconomic to continue operating many of these plants. If you look at the transformers that are sort of the key elements in our transmission and distribution systems, the average age of these transformers is over 40 years old, and that's about their design lifespan. So there's going to be a need just to keep the lights on. I mean, our use of electricity is growing a little bit, not that much, but just to keep the lights on, it's projected by Brattle Group and others that in the US alone, $1.5 to $2 trillion is going to have to be invested between now and 2030 to modernize and replace these aging assets. And so the question is, as you modernize and replace these assets, do you replace them with what already exists, or do you replace them with something new, right? And if you're going to be replacing these assets, how about trying to get that 50% utilization factor up? If you could, let's say, improve through intelligence, more dynamic control, optimized control, if you could improve the capacity utilization, let's say from 50% to 60%, that's maybe $200 billion of investment you might not have to make, right? So there's a huge economic value in finding ways to operate the system much more efficiently and putting investment in technologies that accomplish that, as opposed to replacing, fossil fuel and transformers that use old technology. So achieving this greater efficiency, I would say, in the United States is probably our number one goal and is going to be essential if we don't want to see the cost of electricity become growing to a larger fraction of our household budget. So another driver for grid modernization is increasing the reliability of the system. We are pretty reliable in the U.S. Lights don't go off on a daily basis as they do in some other parts of the world, but we're definitely not best in class. The statistics are in the U.S. that we average about 2 hours a year of distribution level disruptions in our electric supply. The comparable figure for Japan is 16 minutes a year, and for Italy, not a country that I would think would be a paradigm of efficiency, it's 44 minutes a year. So clearly a lot of opportunity for improvement. And studies have shown that power outages in the U.S. Cost our economy about $80 billion a year. So getting some increase in our reliability has, again, a significant economic value. The third driver for our grid modernization is sustainability. And while we don't have a national renewable portfolio standard, and some would argue that it would be incorrect to have a national standard, because what sense does that make when you have, well, let me take an example of Canada. A province like Quebec, I believe, gets about 90% of its power from renewable resources. So you look at the opportunity there versus states like in the southeast part of the U.S. where you just don't have those resources. Having a national standard could in fact set a least common denominator as opposed to an aspirational goal. But there are 29 states that have set renewable portfolio standards, and some of them are very aggressive, like California, which has a 33% goal. To reach that kind of penetration, you need to operate the grid in a much more dynamic way. If you're going to be using wind and solar, which are not only variable, you can't control them. You can predict their output, but you certainly can't control it. And so in order to integrate to those levels, you really need the intelligence in the grid to operate in a much more dynamic way. So I just spent a few minutes trying to sketch out off the top of my head where I think the opportunities are in this evolution over the next 10 to 20 years, and kind of divide them into three categories. There are opportunities on the utility side, opportunities on the customer side, and new opportunities for service providers that provide services either to utilities or customers or both. And clearly in the utility side, renewable generation, storage technologies. As renewable generation comes in, power conversion electronics are going to be very critical to integrating them into the grid and being able to manage them. New types of communication networks, sensors, with all this data, tools that provide visualization and decision support so that the grids can be operated much more efficiently. And a very, very important area potential is cybersecurity technologies and services. The 3,000 utilities that we have in the United States, most of them just do not have the technical capability to deal with the cybersecurity issues that are inherent in this type of grid. On the customer side, the opportunities obviously are in distributed generation for community microgrids, storage technologies. Still a lot of opportunity for advanced building energy management. If you could find low-cost ways to do the sort of optimization of energy within the residential environment, that's really virgin territory. In buildings, there are lots of opportunities to integrate existing systems with some of the other IT capabilities. For example, integrating your calendar system with your system managing your energy usage so that you can predict your load during the course of the day. These are the kinds of things that people are beginning to work on. And obviously smart appliances of the type that I talked about earlier. New types of services, demand aggregation and management using the cloud. I know of some startups that are doing this, working with some real utilities. There are a number of energy efficiency and virtual utilities that are basically selling this sort of negative generation capacity into the market. Energy management applications and services, and someday electric vehicles will take off. If you go to the DOE website, you'll find something called Apps for Energy. Okay, we through our standards effort, working with the industry and the regulatory community, have developed some standards to produce some nationwide standards for the data that is captured by these meters and standardized methods to access the data. This was one application in which this data is used to, it provides a tool that helps you sort of optimize, if you want to do solar on your house, to optimize the capacity that you should install, right? Because you don't want to over-engineer your solar and produce way more. I mean, you want to buy some from your utility, so how much should you really put on? This application will help you figure that out. Other applications that do other useful things. So all this is enabled by a capability called the green button. So if you hear the buzzword, the green button, it's simply an electronic access to your energy usage information made available through this standardized interface. And currently, the White House has been promoting this. We currently have many utilities that have signed on, a lot of vendors that are supporting it, and by early 2013, 27 million customers in the U.S. There are 140 million electricity users in the U.S., so 27 million in a one-year period is a pretty quick penetration. 27 million customers will have this capability available. So I just want to end with some additional thoughts of advice if you're thinking about going into this space. One is, think about energy convergence. Think about that 8% of the household budget that's spent on energy, and how can we use technology to optimize that, and maybe it's optimal to spend more on electricity and less on gas and oil. There's that to play with. Very important is the second point. You have to consider the externalities. Okay, you're dealing here with a large system, an infrastructure, and that has the characteristic that a person who has to make an investment to realize some new capability for the system, the person who makes that investment may not be the person that realizes the value. Okay, so for example, if you live in an area where you don't have time of use pricing or dynamic pricing of electricity, shifting your load from 5 in the afternoon to 2 in the morning isn't really going to save you any money if you're still using the same amount of electricity. But if you did shift that load, there's tremendous value to the utility in better utilization of the system, and eventually that will get passed on to consumers in the form of lower rates, but that'll take time. So what motivation is there for me as a homeowner to spend $100 on some device that helps shift that load if the utility is going to benefit, and I don't know when I'm going to see the benefit in my bill? So you have to have a business model that takes into account the fact that at the time the capability is being deployed, that there's a way of extracting that value from the people who are really benefiting from it. And this means that when you think about the other players in the ecosystem, like the utilities and their suppliers, you really have to evaluate what role should they play in your business plan. Are these people competitors, or should I be thinking of them as channel partners, and as channel partners, finding a way to get access to some of this sort of distributed value. The other thing that makes this very complex is that the utilities and market structures, at least in this country, are not all alike. It's a very, very complex system. We have three types of utilities. We have the investor-owned utilities, which serve about 60% of the people in the U.S. They are regulated by state public utility commissions and micromanaged to the nth degree, and that makes them very, very conservative, very slow-moving. We have hundreds of municipal power systems, which they're self-governing, so they take on the characteristics of the community that they serve. And if you're in a community that's very green, wants to be very reliable, wants first-class infrastructure, they're going to be much more willing to make investments of new technology, new concepts, than utilities that are in much more conservative areas. And then we have the rural area, which is 80% of the U.S. is served by rural co-ops, completely different type of environment. So you have to recognize all of these differences. And finally, it's important to recognize that these differences, and also the fact that states are taking different approaches. California is a completely different environment than New York or Texas. There are a lot of localized opportunities that result from these differences at the state level. So one lesson that I learned in industry is segment, segment, segment. This applies to the nth degree here. You really have to segment this very, very large market very finely to understand what opportunities are available where. So just some thoughts I wanted to pass on. So let me end now, and then I'll take questions by coming back to the frog. And I said I didn't want you to think about the dead bodies of failed startups. I wanted you to think about frogs. And this is a story that my wife likes to tell. The saying is that you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince. Okay. There will be a lot of ideas out there that either won't work, or that you haven't found the right formula to address the regulatory environment or the externalities. But if you could find the right one, there's tremendous value to be caught. And so be prepared to kiss a lot of frogs as you become, hopefully, a Bob Metcalf or Irwin Jacobs or Jay Pulver of the clean tech sector.